Thank you. Hi. Yes, so we'll be talking about how culture can shape even the lowest levels of perception. So, and I mean here the visual perception towards most particularly the visual illusions. Okay, so my question is, how is it that perceiving can sometimes be influenced by what we think, believe, or expect? And what I'll be claiming here is that culture permeates what we see. Now, let me give you an overview. An overview of how we're going to do this today. So first, I'm going to introduce visual illusions, so that then in the end I can establish some links with the social practices. How I'm going to do that is I'm going to look and explore two different ways or frameworks that we can use to explain the phenomenon of visual illusions. The first one is the cognitivist one. And here I'm going to focus on cognitive penetrability and cognitive impenetrability, as it is taught in a special case of predictive processing, such as the prediction error minimization. And then I'm going to explore the inactivist view, which is a competitive view, and I'm going to argue for cultural permeability, which is very much in line with what radical inactivism proposes. Okay, so first step, visual illusions. I'm going to give you a bit of the most famous visual illusions that are everywhere in psychology and cognitive science research. So this is the Ebbinghaus illusion, and do you see any difference between the size of the orange spots?
Yes or no?
Yes. Yes, no, yes, no. Well, it's a bit mixed, right? Because, well, this is famous because what happens is that, well, the size of the orange spots kind of seems to depend on the size of the surrounding black ones. So it seems to give the illusion to some people that they have different sizes. Okay. Another one is the Muller illusion. And in here, some people would say that, well, these two segments are of different sizes. And why is that? Well, because of the direction of the arrows here that give the impression to some people that these are different lengths. Okay. So, how did I find the relevance of visual illusions to the cultural and social practice and how we understand others and how that's going to be important for us in the end of the talk? Okay, so some very basic geometrical illusions seem to exemplify how we act in the social space. Even when we know that something is the case, like for example we just saw with the Muller illusion, we know if we use a ruler that is segments of different size, even when we know that this is the case, we cannot seem to bring ourselves to see that. We still see that they are of different lengths. This might entail some cases, when we look into that, into social practice, this might entail some cases of dissonance in how we act socially and understand others. Okay, so let's now look at the first framework to understand this phenomenon of visual illusions. This is the cognitive penetrability or impenetrability explanation for the phenomenon of visual illusions. Okay. So let me guide you through the modularity of mind, which is a computationalist theory of mind. And here what we have in these containers are what is called in the modularity of mind, modules. Okay? And these modules are taught to give some information, so they receive the output from the input from the world, and they perform some kind of representation or computation, and then they deliver an output to what further calls the central cognitive system, which is then supposed to attach some form of belief to those representations. So this is, in a way, this is a very low level, and that would be the high level, the hardcore stuff, that would be the cognitive stuff, right? Okay. So let's just see in more detail these modules, okay? They have a few features that are quite important, but I'd like to focus in two. One is that they are domain specific. What does that mean? It means that they are sensitive to only certain inputs. So each module would be, for example, one different modularity. One module would be vision, another module would be auditory, another would be smell. So this means that they would be sensitive to only, for example, the visual module would be sensitive only to visual inputs. Okay, so that's what it means by being domain specific. And then another very important feature is that they are encapsulated. That means that they do not share, they do not have information, they do not have access of information found anywhere else in the system. This means that they don't share information between each other and they do not get information from the higher cognitive system. They are informationally encapsulated. Okay, good. So this brings us to the idea that, well, perception is impenetrable because it's specific, it is informationally encapsulated, does not have access to any other information anywhere else other than the inputs that it receives and whatever is going on in the module. So it seems that it is encapsulated in a way that is impenetrable, right? Okay, so there is some acceptance that there can be some top-down modulation, so some kind of hierarchical forms within the module, but this is only within the module. It's not a cognitive penetration or cognitive modulation coming down to the module. It's only within the module, which means that the people advocating for cognitive impenetrability, still today and very recent papers on that, would say that, well, perceptual processing is informationally encapsulated from all the background cognizing, and we can even say from the other modules. Okay, right. We can see this today, for example, as very illustrative. Raftopoulos argues, for example, that in early vision, he argues that early vision is not directly affected by cognition, since its processes do not draw on cognition as an informational resource. Early vision processes do not operate over cognitive contents, which is the essence of the claim that perception is cognitively penetrated. Early vision, he says, is cognitively impenetrable. And this is a very recent paper, 2017. Okay, now, things are changing and people are otherwise finding some evidence and by some observations that actually there might be some dialogue, there might be some influence from cognition to perception. Cognition might influence how we see things. And this is actually motivated by the observation that if it is possible for two different people to have different perceptual experiences coming from the very same sensory signal, then it might be the case that cognizing how we think, believe, or expect might change the way that we see, that we visually see the world. Okay. One important note to make in the cognitive penetrability framework is that anyone that is engaging in this penetrability story must subscribe to some form of content. Okay, they have to say that cognition has to be through and through contentful. And why is that? Well, because they need a link between the contents of cognition and the link between the contents of perception. And because that's the only way that we can have the cognition dialoguing and influencing perception. So these would be the advocates for cognitive penetrability. And this has been discussed at length in this very recent special issue on cognitive penetration and predictive coding. But it dates back to 2013 when Jacob Hui put forward his theory on this special case of predictive processing, the prediction error minimization. And here he says in chapter 6 that prediction error minimization actually entails cognitive penetrability and cognitive impenetrability. So it entails both of them. Let me just give you a very, very short introduction to this computational framework. It has two main principles. The first principle is that the brain is secluded. What does that mean? Well, there is an evidentiary boundary between the brain on the one hand and the external world on the other side, that include the environment and actually the body. So there is this evidentiary boundary between the brain and the body and the environment. Okay? And this secluded brain actually, and I'm going to quote him, becomes an affirmation of simple Cartesian skepticism. Since we cannot obtain an independent view of our position in the world, because remember, the brain is secluded, we cannot exclude the skeptical hypothesis that the sensory input we receive is caused by an evil or scholastic scientist rather than the external states of affairs we normally believe in. The Bayesian framework does entail skepticism. So two principles, brain is secluded and skepticism. This idea of skepticism is what motivates the whole prediction error minimization. And what is that? Well, this is the idea that the brain is seen as a sophisticated hypothesis testing mechanism. Okay, so then inference is going to be needed precisely to overcome this brain's encapsulation in the skull, being inside the black box. I need to infer. So this inference would be simply draw the comparison between the predictions that I have about what is happening in the world and the actual sensory signal. So that's the comparison, that's the inference that I need to make, since I'm taking as granted that the brain is inside the black box without access to the environment and without access to the body itself. Okay, so a little bit more on that. The brain is then seen as this organ of prediction error minimization, which on average and over time continually minimizes the error between the sensory input it predicts on the one hand and the actual sensory input. And how does it do that? Well, it does that through on a basis of models of the world. And this is a very important feature in predictive processing and particularly in prediction error minimization. So the aim of the whole prediction error minimization that the brain goes through and does is precisely to build and update these models. So in short, all behavior, and I'm quoting from the self-evidencing brain, all behavior of the system can be understood in terms of prediction error minimization, in terms of the prediction error minimization interplay between the sensory input and the hypothesis of those internal models that the brain has. Okay? Good. Now, let's have a look on how then it goes from this computational framework, prediction error minimization, the brain as a computer inferring states outside in the world, to say that, well, when does it entail this impenetrability that we were talking about just now in the context of modularity? Well, it says that prediction error minimization entails cognitive impenetrability when there is very little residual prediction error shunted upwards in the system. And for that reason, there is little work for any higher level prior beliefs to do, including the true belief that the lines of the Müller-Lyer illusion are of equal length. So prediction error is sufficiently suppressed at relatively early processing stages. This means that the higher levels of cognition are not communicating with the lower levels of cognition, of which are perception here. Okay? Let me show you. This would be the idea. We have a module that is an early perceptual processing stage that is completely encapsulated and doing all the work on its own, right? And then we have those higher level prior beliefs which have contents and have models, right? But they cannot have access to the lowest levels of perceiving. And for that reason, whatever I am seeing, it is set on the lower level. It cannot be penetrated, influenced, or changed by how I think, believe, or expect. So whatever is happening, whether I'm seeing the illusion or not, is something that is dictated on the lowest levels without any influence whatsoever from cognition. Okay. Now, he also says that, well, this also entails, prediction error minimization also entails cognitive penetrability, which would be the other way around. He says that, that the system engages those prior models that we were talking about. The brain has these modules, so the system will engage these modules in cases of uncertainty, noise, or visual illusions, or even in cases of inputs that are not yet properly learned. Quoting him, the context is that, well, you cannot trust the signal from the world because it's so noisy and uncertain, or there are visual illusions. So what is the system, the brain, going to do? Well, the brain is going to rely on prior knowledge. It's going to rely on the internal modules, the brain modules that it has, in order to explain. Because the signals are so uncertain and there's so much error, the system cannot carry on and on and on forever receiving error. So it has to decide eventually on what is happening. Let me illustrate that. So that would be something like this. That would be cognitive penetrability. The system's got a model in a higher level prior belief. So the system will penetrate all the way down because it is receiving so much error. It's in a non-stop way that it then has to penetrate all the way down and determine, set, what is the model that I'm going to apply to explain what I'm seeing right now. Okay, so that would be cognitive penetrability of the earliest perceptual processing stages. Okay. Good. Brain modules. The most important thing in predictive error minimization, because it seems to solve many, many problems in how we see the world. Okay, let me just guide you through what are these brain modules in prediction error minimization. So they are kind of contents of knowledge. Okay, these contents of knowledge have this peculiarity that they can either be true or false. Okay, that's the most important thing in these brain modules. So they try to capture the world by using some form of truth conditions. They are either accurate or not in capturing what is happening in the outside, external world, to which I have no access directly. Okay, so let me just read it out to you. Okay, so the success of active inference, of this doing this inference, predicting this world, at minimizing prediction error, non-accidentally and reliably depends on the accuracy of perceptual inference. Notice that the accuracy of perceptual inference in turn depends on how well the generative module captures the causal probabilistic structure of the external world. To summarize this part, Jakob Hui puts it: engaging in active inference on the basis of an inaccurate conception of what the world is like is unlikely to land the organism in unsurprising states in the long run. On such view, adaptively acting in the world requires having a good model, requires having these very good brain modules that accurately represent what is the state of affairs, so an S representation of the world. This is analogous to how the chances of our actions succeeding depend on whether the map that we have at our disposal resembles the terrain. So the relevance of modules is to guide action and perception. Okay, so then the question that we ask is culture learned in terms of these brain modules? Ramstad and his colleagues seem to think so. So they say that recent work in computational neuroscience on predictive processing provides a module of how cultural affordances could scaffold the acquisition of socially shared representational content. It seems that in this paper they are committed to the existence of these neurocomputational models that explain how they're able to produce and, most importantly, to guide skilled, intelligent, context-sensitive and adaptive behavior. So the idea is that, well, we rely on these brain modules in order to guide the skilled, intelligent, context-sensitive and adaptive behavior. Okay. So in short, they are saying that in order to be sensitive to cultural affordances, we must know what others expect us to expect. In a recent paper, Sean Gallagher and Jesus and I have written, we actually challenge their view because we are claiming that, well, this musty thinking leads them to embrace an intellectualist position. How so? Well, despite them entertaining the possibility that the whole story about how we are shaped in cultural affordances might be told in contentless, radically inactive terms, in which I'll get to in a minute, they kind of stand halfway in an in-between position between inactivist and cognitivist accounts of cognition that try to marry to the altar of predictive processing. It seems that they cannot imagine how cultural affordances could be explained without appealing to neural modules and special kinds of storage knowledge. And they actually use the expression as stored as higher level priors. So they are committed to this conservative and active account of cognition, through which they hope to account for the special knowledge that they think will be needed to fill the perceived explanatory gap. They do so by starting with the premise that we all come to acquire the shared background knowledge, conceptual frameworks, and dominant values of our culture, to then argue that to explain agents' engagement with contentful affordances, it's required a theory of cultural content and representation. So now I want to test this. I want to test this, what it would be like to use and interpret these cultural affordances through the idea or accepting brain models as explanatory or having explanatory value to how culture shapes or changes perception. So there's the most extensive study on visual illusions. It was done by Siegel, Campbell, and Erskowitz. And they have collected responses for optical illusions. 2 of them are the ones that we just saw, from 1,878 subjects in 15 different Western and non-Western societies. And they came to the observation that European and American samples made significantly more illusion-supporting responses than non-Westerns. So they observed that the susceptibility to visual illusions is dependent on the cultural context. Peoples with different cultures would be differently susceptible to geometrical illusions. Right. So what would be the cognitivist reading of this study? It would look like doing culture with contentful models. So what would it look like? Well, we would say that non-Westerns are rightly representing because they have accurate modules. So they are rightly representing the visual case, while Europeans and Americans are misrepresenting it. But it tends to be the case that all of them, non-Westerns, Europeans, and Americans, interact with their environment successfully. So they are actually adaptively acting, have successful actions, they are able of skilled, intelligent, context-sensitive, adaptive behavior without all of those modules, without the accuracy of perceptual inference. So, there seems to be a problem, because if we assume representational content at the base level, then content either has to shift accuracy or to be explanatorily empty. Some of the worries then that we might have with content and models in the brain can be summarized as this. So the first is that why would a predictive system that is entirely designed to get the world right and equipped with these contentful models, seem content to keep getting the world wrong, as we see that some people in some cultures are permeated by the illusion. The second is that if indeed there are such things as contentful models available, why is it that sometimes, in the case of cognitive impenetrability, as we just saw with Jakob Hui, in the cases of impenetrability, they are denied access to correct the misrepresentation happening down there. So these contentful modules are not recruited to correct what is going on the lower level of perception. And this is the case of cognitive impenetrability. On the other hand, if there are such things as contentful modules, then on the case of cognitive penetrability, why would the system settle on an ad hoc prediction that actually ignores the error and which could actually revise the hypothesis? Why? In both cases, cognitive penetrability and impenetrability, the system is getting the world either wrong or right. Contents here are failing to travel up and down to make good, accurate models of the world, both in cognitive penetrability and cognitive impenetrability. And yet, different cultures interact with the world successfully. Okay, so this brings us to ask, can we explain cultural permeation without these difficulties that models and contentful language raise, one that does not rely on cognition as being through and through contentful? And we get to the last part. So this would be the idea of cognitive permeation, and is very close to radical inactivism, has been developed by Dan. And this will be an alternative to models and contentful ways of thinking culture. Okay, so the basic idea is that brains do not evolve in a vat. And inactivists start with very different assumptions from cognitivists that we just described about the nature of cognition and how to explain adaptive responsiveness. They propose quite a different way of thinking about how culture connects and influences cognition. How is that? Well, the system is not taught to have models. The system is taught to be a model. And this makes already a very important distinction. Organisms become the best model of their phenotype by an embodied anticipation. So it's something that is very much less intellectual and much more embodied. Okay, so the idea of cultural permeability through the radical inactivism would be then something like the human brain not only evolving along with the human body and working the way it does because of that, but also dynamically coupled to a body that is in turn dynamically coupled with the environment. Now, the organism then operates in a situation itself, which is the interaction itself with the environment through the body that it enacts, rather than on a model, which would be the contentful way that we just saw with cognitivism, of the situation that is inferred by the brain. Okay, so this is very much comes a little bit inspired in how Wright derives this idea from rule following from Wittgenstein. The idea that knowledge is a competence. We can avoid this demand by speaking of an organism or a system's embodied know-how or competence. That would be here a sort of a form of an embodied anticipation rather than an intellectual knowledge. Rather than assuming that it must be learning accurate modules, as we just saw, or using contents of knowledge that have to be true or false. Okay. So then recently Ramstad came to say that, well, but this isn't totally in line with our new take on generative models, where the model is a model of behavior. It is a control system. Well, one thing that it needs to note is that if radical inactivism, non-contentful view turns out sound, then it pressures the view that even embodied priors need to accord to Bayesian models, so the brain modules. Why is that? Well, because we're going to need to look into what is it that is contentful in, for example, proprioceptive predictions, which are bodily predictions. Okay. And to elaborate just a little bit on this, the idea is that we need to note is that even if a living system, for example, the stomach or a cell, can be described by a scientific representation that predicts its mechanical processing and chemical signaling, does it follow that the living system itself, the stomach, computes anything similar to contents, or that it can be reduced to abstraction of models of the sort suggested by prediction error minimization scheme? Okay, that's something to think about. Okay, now, what's the take of radical inactivism on this cultural permeation? We're finally getting there. So here, culture is not learned in terms of contents of information that can be true or false, but they are an embodied competence or an anticipation that mirrors the history of the cognitive interactions with our particular environments in the form of a practice. So there's a history of all the practices that the organism already had in a certain culture. So we can say that it is the situated interaction of expecting the world in a certain way. So what would be the repercussions of looking at culture as a situated interaction? Well, the interaction itself shapes how something is perceived. The situated predictive systems may grasp regularities pertaining to their particular forms of interactions. So we can explain the study, the Westerns versus non-Westerns way of seeing the visual illusions, as Europeans and Americans on the one hand and non-Westerns on the other, they expect the world in a certain way, different ways actually, according to the history of their interactions intrinsically reward-orientated due to prior experiences of perceptual environments. So if that is the case and looks sound, then there is no need for inferences in this respect. Because the reward-orientated intentionality does not entail drawing contentful hypotheses and selecting the best one, because as a result of the context of enculturation, there is only one way the lines in the mood layer will look to certain people, depending on the culture they enact. If culture is not a representational mechanism, but an intentionality towards a visual target, the situated prediction cannot then get the world wrong, because it's not about truth conditions. It's not about being right or wrong, true or false. So it does not make sense to say that Europeans and Americans are wrong while non-Westerners are right. And so it is then clear why all succeed in their respective perceptual interactions. How does this link with the social space? Well, very basic geometrical illusions illustrate how culture can change the visual space, the way that I see things, objects, and geometry. Culture so can change social space, which can entail cases of dissonance in how we act socially and understand others. At least it is very, very clear from the cases in visual illusion, so we might be interested in looking how that also may or may not happen in the social space. Okay, so coming to an end, conclusions. First one, well, there is a long tradition of trying to understand how culture influences cognition. We've looked at the cognitivist account. It seems that the cognitivist account approaches culture as something that creates some kind of internal representations that exert an effect on cognition and perception, and they do so through models and contentful representations. I've argued instead that culture and context are woven into perception and action from their earliest inception. and that enculturation is an embodied anticipation, and it does not and is not about contentful models. And this is me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ines. Great. Okay, so we have time for some questions.
Yeah, I'm a bit puzzled by this, how do we think of this idea of success? So I understand how in the model picture you would think that. I'm not sure whether that is truth and falsity, but it's something like accuracy and adjusting the model to the noise. But what does it mean to say that that these models are successful?
Oh no, it just means that, well, you imply models of the world so that you can interact with a world from which you are secluded, right? Yeah. So you build and you update these models so that they can guide action.
No, okay, but I was thinking, because you were saying, well, both in the Westerns and the non-Western have this successful
interaction.
I'm not sure whether, I'm not thinking of something at the level of culture. I'm just thinking about my ordinary experience in the world. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of uncertainty in that. There's a lot of. So I wonder whether, once you have read, you get rid of the picture in which this is a model which has this hypothesis and about the hypothesis sort of adjusts or not, whether there is what is useful to think of the alternative view, sort of the more embodied view, in terms of successful and non-successful. What would that mean? What it would be an unsuccessful coping? What it's a successful coping? You see, it is a very open question.
Yeah.
Whether it's useful for us to think in those terms of success versus non-successful.
Well, it is because you can actually engage in the world in this very embodied way that you don't really need to go and rely on higher levels of thinking. It is very easy to engage in the world without using these brain models that need to be accurate.
Right, but it's more like there are different ways of doing it rather than there being successful versus non-successful, because even if you are trying to describe all of the alternatives as a successful, I don't really understand what is a non-successful version. Like, I'm thinking of, as always, the children. And they, there might be a lot of they do in their own way, but I wouldn't say that they are not successful. And they are successful, actually. on even me myself, that I have, when I interact with the world, sometimes, I turn in the wrong corner or whatever, but I'm still dealing with whatever ways in which I'm dealing with the environment. So I'm just wondering, once you get rid of the model and the vision that comes with it, which is very representational, whether it's used for this distinction between the successful and the unsuccessful.
Maybe there's an issue with the successful word. The thing is that you navigate the world in a way that you don't find it strange, right? It's the idea that you are relating to your environment in a way that it doesn't show up as being strange to you.
You're talking about your kids again.
I'm not sure whether that's not already an idealization. I think that it might be a matter of degree. The level of extreme.
Because obviously there is a learning process. There is a learning process. That's the history of the interactions, that eventually you don't have to rely on, you just need the embodied way of, and the world won't seem strange to you, right? But there's a process.
Dan, you have a finger.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to have to jump in. Cool. I think, let me try and reiterate what Glenn is saying, because I think it doesn't, first of all, tell me if I got it wrong, it doesn't alter the argument against the cognitiveness that you've got going, right? Because that sets them up for the idea that they've got these strange choices to make between two different low-level perceptual responses, and now one of them has to be right and one has to be wrong, they have to revise classical logic or whatever, they have to handle that seeming mess, right? Deciding, once you've brought more than one into the picture, because you can say that when you're only focusing on the one case, which is what usually happens, but it starts to get messy when you start bringing in African perception and say, well, did they get the illusion right or wrong? I think that's your argument.
Yep.
So if I understand what you're saying, just to clarify this, when you go to the inactivist side, you take out those standard epistemic notions, whether the notion of success falls away, because it's just like the recalculating on your car. If you go one way, there's many possible ways that you can get back, but you don't have to think that you get in a zone where it's a black and white, a binary between successful and not successful. Is that?
But it could be. So you can run it. I run it like that, but I can also make it a little more extreme, so it will be more pressing towards the relativist side. It could be like, why? So can there be a way of coping with the world which is it looks to us very complex. It looks to us very successful. Yet, how do we have a measure of this? What does it mean to say that there are successful?
It's Mr. Magoo.
Yeah, exactly. That's why.
It's Mr.
Exactly.
Magoo. Mr. Magoo. If anybody has
Okay,
It's okay. I don't have a problem with Mr. Martin.
I don't get the Mr. McGee, but it's fine. Okay. Good. Shall I?
You can either answer or we'll see if there's other questions, or if you want to come back and.
I don't know the Mr. Magoo.
You don't know who he is?
No, I know Mr. Magoo, but I
Okay,
don't.
yeah.
Well, the idea is that you can cope even if you already dispose of certain idea of accuracy that comes from with the predictive, especially with the representation. And so there's an idea of accuracy there which fits something which I agree with you. It's a bit problematic because I don't really understand. But the idea is that they want to, have the cake and eat it too, so you get the truth, falsity, or something close to it.
Yeah.
But then you're saying, no, there are these alternative ways of coping with the same environment, and that doesn't really make sense to say that one is accurate and the other is not, because they are just two alternative ways. And I'm asking you why, but then if you call these two successful, it seems that this is contrasted with an unsuccessful one. And like Mr. Magoo might be thought to be the unsuccessful, yet Mr. Magoo is quite successful, right?
Yeah,
Is he not? Though, but he cannot. We see it from our own conception of what we will do in under the same circumstances. It's like he's taking so much risks there, right? But this is just the way we deal with the environment, or we think we deal with the environment. So I'm thinking, this can be just saying, well, we do need maybe to think about what it means in this alternative picture to distinguish between good, bad, or successful, not successful, or maybe even more in a more extreme vein, we can say, well, no, it's just very relative. There's no common measure.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to because it seems that with the practice within a certain culture, you have no control over it. Right? If you are susceptible to the visual illusion, you are susceptible to the visual illusion. You cannot bring yourself to see otherwise or differently, right? So it's kind of you are being changed. Your perception is being changed by, and you have no really control over it. So it's not that you have this brain model that you are applying and that is either accurate or is not accurate, but it's more like the practice makes you lose control. Right? You don't have control over how you're going to see it. So it makes it very embodied. In a very embodied way, you are expecting the world in a certain way. So it seems that it makes a bit more sense to say, well, let's come down to the more embodied way of interacting with the world and perceiving it that has actually an influence from culture, rather than going higher level brain models to explain what is going on and how culture is influencing, because then we bump into this problem. So does it mean that half the world is wrong and half the world is not? But everyone is carrying on with their lives.
Right.
That's an audience question.
It's a totally different question. So I was wondering about the reach of cultural permeation, in the sense that, so in the rec story, there's this the not proposal that the content emerges from our engagement with like linguistic environment.
Yeah.
So this is like part of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you get like enculturated in like these linguistic cultures, you start to have like experiences with content and like prominently like thinking in terms of contents. Do you think that these contentful ways of engaging with the environment permeates all the way down to perception, or is it, in your view, like perception something separate from these like effects of like the contentful effects of?
That depends. Actually, that depends, because you can have one way that perception can be contentful, and another way that perception is not contentful. There is another study that is quite interesting to illustrate precisely this, which is speakers, and I think you know of it. The speakers of Greek, they have two different words for two different shades of blue, which we don't have, right? So their brains are responding differently to native English speakers. So you can see how language is actually influencing the way that they see the blue. So that's quite interesting to illustrate how, at some point, language has an influence on, let's call it, very basic perception, in order that we can build in these more contentful representations from these classical five senses, exteroceptive ways of seeing the world.
Yeah. So so it's good to have an example. So I think my question is about how we should understand that. So if I understand you correct, are you saying that so these different color experiences come from like different linguistic environments, and so they engage in different ways of thinking about colors, and that affects the way we experience colors. Does that mean that now once you engage with like color languages, you start to have contentful perception of color? Or does that mean that these contentful environments changes your like contentless perception?
Can permeate in that sense. This cultural environment, these now new linguistic symbolic strategies that you now know, can permeate how you can easier identify these shades of blue, which people that don't have those symbolic strategies would be. So that's the distinction between our Greek, how the Greek brain responds when it sees those shades of blue, and, for example, the non-Greek.
Yeah. So the question is, does that mean that once you learn like Greek, the Greek words for blue, do Greek children start to have
that would be helpful.
Experiences with content?
That would be helpful for them to distinguish.
So are you saying that the experience itself is still contentless, although it's like shaped or permeated by these linguistic environments?
Yeah, in some form, yeah.
Okay, so
yeah.
it is still contentless.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah. So is there a gap between, so is there kind of a division between perception and cognition in the sense that...
No, absolutely not. No, perception would be a form of cognition.
Oh,
but perception permeated by cognition in the sense that when you get these strategies that are symbolic, that are scaffolded in language, then that might help you see different shades of, in this case, it's different shades of blue that other people would not be, could see them.
Yeah, okay. I'm still a bit lost, but someone has a finger.
No, I had a finger, but yeah.
Dan always has a finger.
Call on me. Okay. I just throw in. So this is a great old debate that Glenn and I always had around John McDowell. I think we're very close to it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about John McDowell.
Yeah. So I just to throw in.
Yep.
Is it? So one thing you didn't mention in this talk, which we were talking about content, was the character of experience and stuff like that. So whether that also is shaped or altered, and I wonder whether that ties into what might be a remainder that stays out of does stay outside the bounds of the culture, the cultural aspects, or is there? I guess Katsunori's question, if I understood it, was like any way that once it permeates, if it permeates fully, doesn't that just make the whole of the experience contentful, or if there's some dimension or capacities that resist content? That's what he's trying to say. And it seemed like the story would push us, if I'm getting that right, is that we should be pushed to the idea that after we've been acculturated, attain a second nature, that kind of takes over the whole story. Is that what you want to be saying? Or?
No, that's not what I wanted to be saying. I want to be saying that no, you still have the capacity of experience the world in a non-contentful way. That depends on how you are directed, on what you are engaged with, or the practice you are doing, or what your aim is in the interaction itself. I think that you still can have this basic subjective experience, even if it can be at some points permeated by more cognitive attitudes.
I think my question was in some sense the other way around. So I agree that I think not agree, but then because I'm not really settled, I'm inclined to say that there is this basic, there's always this basic contentless form of perception, and I think we're on the same page on that. I think my question is whether we want to say that once we are enculturated, we also have a contentful form of perception too.
Yeah.
And in that case, I'm not sure how to tell the difference between contentless perception and contentful perception. In this case of perceiving a Greek person's perception of blue color, is this a case of contentful perception or contentless perception? And I'm kind of lost, how to tell the difference, where to draw the line.
Yeah, I think it would be a contentful. Yeah, but I'll need to think about it. Good question.
I think from what her talk, there is an answer to his question, and it's because you are saying that concepts that are in the practices, and that when they sort of practice it themselves, if you think of these as embodied patterns of reaction, something, can actually shape the way we perceive, which means that they become conceptual. Some of it doesn't mean that everything has to be like that, but the examples you were interested in are examples like that.
Yeah.
That's exactly what she's saying. I think, I mean, not for everything that you can perceive, but for a cluster of these, there is that. There is some symbols that are sort of shaping the very way in which you bodily react to the things to which you are exposed. And those are concepts, are not symbols.
I'll let you guys have it for a minute, yeah? Just let him respond.
Okay.
Yeah? Just for the fun
of
the discussion.
So I think we can draw a distinction between two ways in which concepts affect perception. And one is by making perception contentful. And the other is by keeping perception contentless, but changing the kind of perceptual responsiveness we have, the contentless kind of responsiveness we have.
I don't understand that distinction very well. I think because if you think, which it's true that she was neutral maybe about it, she didn't give enough, all of the details, but if you think of concepts as also patterns of behavior that are governed by certain, norms, then there is no distinction between one and the other, because what it would mean to say, what is the first, I don't understand the first option, so the idea that it becomes contentful versus the idea that your ways of responding to your environment get shaped by symbolic practices. So you would think that this what I just said is a description of what it is to say that something is contentful. There is no, the other idea of contentful is nonsensical, or it's not well crafted, or it's ill-conceived, or there is underlying this talk, there is an alternative view of what content is. So it's very different from the way how we would think of content.
Beautiful. We're right on the money. I'm going to give Ines the last word on this, so that you can preside over it. Whatever you want to say, it's yours.
What I want to say, I just want to say, I'll just make one point that I didn't make in this talk, which is speaking to that these two different ways of perceiving. One would be contentless, the other one would be contentful. And why is it that one is contentful, the other one is contentless? Well, the contentless one would be the subjective experience of experiencing something that is not yet permeated by culture. right? And then you have the other one, which would be permeated by culture. That does not necessarily entail that you have these models that are accurate or not. It does not entail that is that, but you do have already acquired some symbolic strategies that will help you out with this subjective experience of this of seeing something, right? And as I was saying to Glenda, you don't really have control over this. Like, you get enculturated and you lost it. You can't bring yourself to see it differently.
Well, and there endeth the session. So thank you very much.
Thank you.